Close your eyes and imagine the ultimate betrayal of trust. Imagine looking up at the people wearing the uniform sworn to protect you, only to realize they are the predators. Imagine a bullet tearing through your spine, stealing your legs forever, and as you bleed out on the floor, the man who pulled the trigger drops a weapon next to your hand to justify your murder. Now imagine the world believing his story over your silence. You were 19 years old, a young immigrant who had traveled from Honduras to build a life. It was 1996, and you were living in the Rampart division of Los Angeles, an area that had become a sprawling, concrete battleground. The streets were sweltering, soaked in the oppressive heat of Southern California and the constant, low-frequency hum of police sirens. Your neighborhood was deeply working class, a community of immigrants trying to survive. But it was also territory claimed by the notorious 18th Street Gang, a sprawling network that cast a long, dark shadow over every block, every alleyway, and every apartment complex. You had affiliations, ties to the streets that were almost impossible to avoid when you grew up in that specific zip code. But you had no prior criminal convictions. You were not a killer. You were not a kingpin. You were a 19-year-old kid expecting a daughter you had never even met. What you did not know, what no one in the city truly understood yet, was that the most dangerous, heavily armed, and ruthless gang operating in the Rampart division did not wear gang colors. They wore the dark blue uniforms of the Los Angeles Police Department. They were known as CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. They were an elite, untouchable anti-gang unit operating with absolute impunity. The CRASH officers had their own culture, their own violent initiation rites, and their own tattoos, featuring a skull and a cowboy hat surrounded by the dead man's hand of poker cards. They did not police the streets, they ruled them. They robbed banks, stole drugs, beat civilians, and planted evidence. To them, you were not a citizen with constitutional rights. You were simply collateral damage waiting to happen. It was October 12, 1996. You were inside an apartment building. The details of that day started completely ordinary. There was no intense standoff. There was no shootout. You were completely unarmed. Without warning, the door was breached. The wood splintered, the frame cracked, and the terrifying, overwhelming presence of armed men flooded the cramped space. It was Officer Rafael Perez and his partner, Officer Nino Durden. They did not announce themselves with the intent to arrest. They did not order you to the ground with your hands behind your head. The violence was instantaneous and absolute. They forced your hands into heavy steel handcuffs. And then, the unthinkable happened. While you were restrained, the officers raised their service weapons and opened fire. The sound of the gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening. The bullets tore into your body. The kinetic impact was like being struck by a freight train. You collapsed onto the linoleum, your head near the entrance of the actual door. The pain was a white-hot, blinding agony that radiated through your chest. But it was quickly overshadowed by something far more terrifying. A creeping, heavy numbness began to spread from your waist down. Your legs, the limbs that had carried you from Honduras to Los Angeles, were suddenly gone from your mind's map of your own body. You were paralyzed for life. As you lay there, bleeding profusely onto the floor, you watched the nightmare escalate from attempted murder to an elaborate, cold-blooded frame-up. Officer Rafael Perez did not reach for his radio to call for a paramedic. He did not attempt to stop your bleeding. Instead, he reached down, pulled out a backup weapon, a firearm with an obliterated serial number, and meticulously placed it right next to your body. He was setting the stage. They were going to claim that you, a 19-year-old kid, had ambushed two heavily armed LAPD officers. You were suffocating on your own blood, paralyzed, and watching the men who just stole your legs steal your freedom too. You woke up in a sterile, brightly lit hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of heart monitors and the heavy scent of antiseptic. The agonizing realization that you could not feel the lower half of your body crashed into you like a physical weight. But you were not treated as a victim who had miraculously survived an execution. You were treated as an assassin. The LAPD had filed their official reports. Rafael Perez and Nino Durden orchestrated a flawless, synchronized lie. Durden did most of the talking, weaving a narrative where you were an armed, dangerous threat who had forced them to shoot in self-defense, and Perez nodded along, confirming every fabricated detail. You were pulled from the hospital and dragged into the machinery of the Los Angeles criminal justice system. You were wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair. You looked up at the judge, at the jury box filled with citizens, and at the prosecutors who were supposed to seek the truth. You tried to tell them what happened. You told your defense attorney, you told the court through a translator, that the gun wasn't yours, that you had never even seen the weapon until they presented it as evidence. You told them you were unarmed. You told them the police had shot you while you were defenseless. In 1996, the word of an elite LAPD anti-gang officer was gospel. The jury looked at Perez and Durden, sharp in their pressed uniforms, speaking with the calm, practiced authority of men who knew the system was rigged in their favor. Then they looked at you, a paralyzed, working-class immigrant with gang affiliations. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The jury found you guilty of assaulting the officers. When the time for sentencing arrived, the judge looked down at you from the elevated bench. There was no pity in his eyes. He sentenced you to 23 years and 4 months in a maximum security prison. You were 19. Your life was effectively over. You were wheeled out of the courtroom, down the long, echoing corridors of justice, an innocent boy trapped in a broken body, bound for a concrete grave. Prison is a crucible designed to break the human spirit, but for a paralyzed teenager, it is a daily, agonizing exercise in profound vulnerability and terror. You were transported to a prison hospital ward, thrust into an environment where survival depended on strength, a currency you no longer possessed. You were confined to a narrow, squeaking wheelchair or a thin, plastic-covered mattress. You relied on indifferent, overworked prison medical staff for your most basic human needs. You suffered through the constant threat of pressure ulcers, the terrifying loss of bodily autonomy, and the agonizing phantom pains that radiated from a lower half you could no longer move. But the physical suffering was nothing compared to the psychological terror. You were labeled a cop killer. To the guards, you were the scum of the earth, a violent criminal who had tried to murder 2 of their brothers in blue. Their contempt was palpable in every interaction. Months bled into years. The 1990s marched toward the new millennium. Your daughter was born, a child you had never met, growing up in a world where her father was locked away as a violent criminal. You were entirely alone with the truth. You knew exactly what had happened in that apartment. You knew the gun was planted. You knew the officers were monsters. But the sheer, crushing weight of the justice system rested on your chest, suffocating your truth under mountains of official paperwork and stamped convictions. You were serving a 23-year sentence. You believed you would die in that wheelchair, inside those walls. While you rotted in a prison medical ward, the architects of your misery continued to terrorize the streets of Los Angeles. But the arrogance that allowed Rafael Perez to shoot an unarmed teenager eventually became his undoing. Corrupt cops do not operate on a moral compass. They operate on pure, unchecked greed. On August 25, 1998, Officer Rafael Perez was arrested. He was not arrested for framing you. He was arrested because he walked into an LAPD property room and brazenly stole 6 pounds of cocaine, an amount with a staggering street value estimated at $800,000. The LAPD had discovered that their elite anti-gang unit was operating a massive criminal enterprise. Perez's first trial ended in a mistrial, but facing a second trial and a severe prison sentence for the cocaine theft, the arrogant predator finally broke. In late 1999, Perez reached a plea agreement with the prosecutors. In a 5-year prison sentence and immunity from further prosecution for anything short of murder, Perez agreed to sing. Over the course of 9 months and more than 50 exhaustive interviews, investigators sat across a table from Rafael Perez and listened as he systematically dismantled the Los Angeles Police Department. He implicated roughly 70 officers in widespread misconduct, painting a horrifying picture of the crash unit's culture. He detailed the beatings, the false arrests, the perjury, and the absolute disdain for the law. He admitted that 90% of the crash officers were knowingly framing civilians and perjuring themselves on the witness stand. And then, on his very first interview, just 2 days after signing his plea agreement, Rafael Perez brought up your name. He sat in that interrogation room. He casually confessed to the crime that had stolen your life. He told the investigators that you were unarmed. He confessed that he and Nino Durden had overreacted, shot you, and then planted the weapon with the obliterated serial number to justify the bloodbath. He admitted that they had gone into a court of law and committed perjury to ensure you were locked away. The revelation sent a seismic shockwave through the district attorney's office. Deputy District Attorney Rosenthal, upon learning that the LAPD had shot and framed you, took a step that was virtually unprecedented in the history of the department. He prepared a writ of habeas corpus, a legal petition almost exclusively filed by defense attorneys, demanding your immediate release from prison. The system that had moved with such terrifying, unyielding force to destroy you suddenly scrambled to undo its own catastrophic failure. Within a week of the filing, the prison doors finally unlocked. In September 1999, you were wheeled out of the maximum security facility. You were 22 years old. The sunlight hit your face, but it did not erase the trauma of the last 3 years. Your grandmother spoke to the press. "I knew he didn't do nothing. I knew he was innocent." The city of Los Angeles was forced to reckon with the monster it had created. As the Rampart scandal exploded into the largest police corruption crisis in the city's history, leading to over 100 overturned convictions, your name became the tragic centerpiece of the fallout. You filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the LAPD and the city. In November 2000, the city awarded you a $15 million settlement, the largest police misconduct payout in Los Angeles history at the time. Rafael Perez eventually pleaded guilty to federal civil rights and firearms violations for what he did to you, receiving a sentence that felt like a slap on the wrist compared to the life he stole. Nino Durden also cut a deal, facing federal prison time for the attempted murder. But as you sat in your wheelchair, holding a check that declared you a multi-millionaire, the true, devastating cost of police corruption was undeniable. $15 million could not buy back the 3 years of terror you endured in a maximum security medical ward. You had survived the most lethal gang in Los Angeles. You had outlasted the corrupt cops, the blind judges, and the broken system. But the system had worked exactly the way the officers intended it to. It took an immigrant kid from the streets, threw him away in a concrete box, and never looked back until one of its own got caught with his hands in the evidence locker. If Javier's story made your blood boil, I need you to do 2 things right now. First, hit the like button and subscribe to Oddly Accurate so we can keep exposing these broken systems. Second, drop down into the comments and tell me, if you were handed $15 million today, would it ever be enough to forgive the men who put you in a wheelchair? Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next case.